Before I went to university, before I'd even considered blacksmithing, my initial hopes was to become a doctor. So I'm a professional blacksmith, bladesmith and cutler. Most of the time I'm reproducing historic items, researching them, reproducing them as accurately as we can, mostly with a focus on things like medieval eating knives and cutlery. At school I was always fond of history. As I went on to go to do it at university, I wanted a job where I didn't want to work in an office basically. Wanted some physical work involved in it, something that's a bit creative as well. Saw blacksmithing courses. I've always played with the idea. Absolutely loved it on some night courses. Finished university, went back to college. So yeah, I was hooked, basically. I didn't do bladesmithing right away. I've done small-scale sculptures, I've done handrails for people's gardens, and maybe it's only about 4 or 5 years ago that I decided, you know what, actually what I want to do is bladesmithing. I went on a little short course to just get a bit more of the basics, and for about 2 years I've been developing that to fully being a bladesmith. I do enjoy the research. I find an item of interest and I want to reproduce it so I can hold it in my hand and see how it works. And suddenly you get a greater appreciation for how those knives were used. The research usually comes from the archaeological records. The vast majority are reproduced from the archaeological drawings, where we have all the dimensions. We can take everything, scale it all out, make sure we get the right thickness, blade shape, everything. The Iron Age in Britain and parts of continental Europe, I would say, is maybe my speciality. At the moment, I'm really enjoying researching 17th century eating knives and travel sets. There's some very beautiful knives in there. I am trying to stay true to how they were done before. We always hand forge them. I don't laser cut them. It's always trying to push to be more accurate to the archaeological examples. I try to keep power tool usage to a minimum, and where I do use power tools, I try to make them relative to what was available. So they had 13th century large clay grindstones, so I can use a grinding wheel on it. It might be a little bit faster than what they had, but it's still essentially the same technology. So beyond the basic hammer, tongs and chisels, it will go through everything from, as I said, clay grindstones, modern belt grinders, hand files. It really becomes endless, and I've got more whetstones and sharpening stones than I can dream of. But ultimately the hardest thing would have to be is when they made their knives, it was the first time that knife was made and they didn't work to measurements. They went, there you go, there's a knife. Now that I'm reproducing theirs, I have to forge it exactly to what they did. That reproduction is the hardest part. The particular knife we're making today is the Finnish puukko. Basically, puukko in Finnish means to stab. It was a knife that until about 1975, more or less everyone carried. It was your everyday knife. You used it for woodwork, you used it for carving, for fishing, for hunting, for cutting your meat to eating with. We're forging out one of these made out of 2 bars of wrought iron, welded together with tool steel in between. Very traditional way of creating knives. And we've forged out from a section of that. We've taken a small end of it. The bar itself is probably about 16 millimeters square, and we've now forged a couple of inches of that out into a 12 centimeter long blade and a 10 centimeter long tang. Forged that out, shaped it on the grinder, removing any mistakes or smoothing out the edges. Although I don't like to go too far with that because I like to leave some semblance of it having been hand forged in there to show people that yes, this has been in a forge, hammers have touched this. Keeping the blade shape in a very traditional style that also nods as well to the roots of the Finnish and the Hungarian peoples. So it's a nod to both those cultures that I find quite fascinating as well. And it's now sitting in a very, very strong brew of coffee because we're acid etching it basically. Coffee's fairly acidic. The reason to doing this is to bring up the different colours. The knife being made out of iron and steel, it will bring out a contrast between those two materials. After that, we've still got to make the handle. I'm still designing it in my head. I'm flitting back and forth between what type of handle I'm going to put onto it. You've just got to take your time, I find, with doing the handles. Slow right down, make sure you get it right. Because the handles can involve bronze work, woodworking, bone working, even knives where they have leather scales on each side. So some of these have things like yew or ivory. Now I use faux ivory, an acrylic substitute. Both yew and that substitute are incredibly brittle. So when you're trying to do the final piece, you're peening the tang to lock it all together, you just take one mishammer hit and it shatters the handle. Having become a bladesmith and a cutler, I've had to learn how to work with wood, antler, bone, horn, leather. I'm even having to learn a bit of jewellery making and stoneworking to hopefully reproduce knives that have agate handles on them, which is going to be a very big challenge. Earlier this year, we were allowed to butcher a sheep that had been killed, and that meant I took out all its leg bones, stripped as much meat as we could, buried them near ants' nests. The ants have stripped all the remaining meat off, and I'm now just sun drying them, removing the marrow, cleaning them up, getting them ready to make some knife handles from them, basically. What is great when forging these things, everything else doesn't matter. It's all about what's happening there and then at that moment, which is wonderful. You don't care about what's going on in the outside world. You are just making that knife, and you can really turn it into a labour of love. Most of the time, it's quite relaxing. It's not to say that there are not times that you're pulling your hair out. Knives break, you accidentally take too much material off when grinding, you sharpen it wrong, things happen. Perhaps the best thing is, no matter what the knife, there's generally a very logical progression through everything. Yeah, that's quite therapeutic. And most people always seem to think it's because, oh, you know, swords and knives, they're cool, they're sharp, and medieval knights fighting and things like that. But there's a heck of a lot more satisfaction when you've completed it. You've got a working tool, and making them very specific for particular uses is also great. When you're forging the blades, you can feel for a very long time that this isn't going to plan, this isn't working. And then that moment when you're going through the final phases of heat treating it, and you're putting it on the fire, and you can see the glow, and it just highlights the actual shape that you've achieved. You see the silhouette, and you actually start to see, yeah, there's the knife. I can hold it up to a scale copy, and it fits perfectly within the silhouette of the original. There's a lot of pride in that, being able to say, I've reproduced it exactly.